Hi, everybody. Today's pre-accident podcast is brought to you by Underwriters Laboratory, Worker Health and Safety.
So at UL, we're really trying to move the ball forward related to the health and well-being of workers, but ultimately trying to keep people safe and healthy on the job, i.e. not exposed to injuries. That's our most important thing. And so last year we launched the Integrated Health and Safety Institute, which is really focused on that arena, and we're developing additional research to support new ways of thinking, new views of thinking and learning. The idea of promoting through advocacy and outreach. We're conducting roadshows throughout the U.S. to discuss our approach. And then we're also developing standards. So UL's a standards writer, and we're going to be developing standards not only on the integration of health and safety, but hopefully in 2016 start work around the new view.
All this at ulworkplace.com. Now, let's listen to the podcast.
You can fall over on a tugboat. You can't fall over on a submarine.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Pre-Accident Podcast. I am your amazing host. That's right, I said amazing host. My name's Todd Conklin, and today you're in for a treat. One of the perennial, is that right? Perennial? That's right, that's it. One of the perennial podcast stars, the big star of the podcast is our guest today. Today, we're going to spend some time with Tony Muschara, and I am super excited about it. You know, Tony's the kind of guy that he's just a thinker, and he's constantly pondering and pondering and pondering. But he's a thinker not in the academic sense of the word, although I would suggest he's quite an academic. He's a thinker in sort of how we think about applying these notions of safety differently, of new view, into our world in reality. Not as it looks on a textbook, although Tony's going to talk about his new book, which is coming out soon, and I'm sure I'll tell you more about that as details become more prevalent. But Tony's going to talk to you today about a relatively new definition of risk. Now, I think I've made it no secret that I am very non-enamored by our traditional understanding of risk. Probability times severity equals risk. If you're an insurance cat, and I know you guys listen, then an actuarial table is a great way to understand and manage the financial or economic impact of risk. And we've sort of taken operationally the economic model to measure risk for people who actually do work. And it doesn't work for crap. It's terrible. I've said it before. You've heard me say it. I'll say it again. What Tony's done is said maybe the way we look at risk fundamentally needs to shift. Thank God someone else is seeing this, because risk exists only in the eye of the beholder, the operator. The actual real risk is in how the worker feels about the work they're about to do. And Tony's really started peeling the string, and he's come up with a model that I think is worth noting. And his model says that really we don't manage risk by probability times severity. What we say is there is the asset, he'll define that, that's the thing that we're protecting. There's the hazard, that's the thing that can hurt somebody. And there's the person. And that risk exists because it's asset plus hazard plus person equals risk. And it's the plus signs that Tony has gotten really fixated on. So that's the podcast. I think you're going to enjoy it. Now, a couple things before we go much further into this. Tony gets a phone call in the middle of this podcast, which I don't really understand, like a speaker. I don't know. I didn't ask him what it was. But it clearly distracts him for a moment, and it kind of makes the Skype go a little nutball. But I'll try to fix it as much as I can and make it sound good. I know, and you know, that just having the chance to listen to Tony for 30 minutes is probably worth its weight in gold. I know you're going to get a lot of good out of this. My life's good. Traveling again, because that's what I do. Man, I am so impressed with you guys. These companies that I go out and look at are just getting better and better and better, and it sort of equates into, more productivity, more efficiency. But what really is happening is fewer people are getting hurt, and way fewer people are dying. Now, I don't know how to measure that, except to tell you that I'm really proud of you. And the fact that lots of things aren't happening should actually cause you to sleep good at night. You're doing a great job. And let's reemphasize that by listening to Tony Muschara. So without any further ado, podcasters, thank you for being a part of this. Listen to this one carefully. Maybe even take a note. Unless you're driving, then don't take a note. Take a note and see what you think about what Tony has to say. Without any further ado, here, my friends, is Tony Muschara on his notion of the importance of the plus sign. So what are you thinking? Talk to me about what you're thinking, because everyone is interested in what you're thinking.
Well, early this year, I've been doing some work with several biotech companies, and I did a lot of training with managers. And the big thing that's on their radar is, what do you manage? How do you manage human performance and human error? And you remember back in the old IMPO days, they had the RE plus MD would drive down the frequency of events.
Sure, I remember that, absolutely.
Yeah. So I went back to that, and I just basically rethought, what are the levers? What are the things that managers need to pay attention to when it comes to the risk of human error? So I started breaking down the words and looking at the words, and the way I define an event is harm to an asset due to some uncontrolled transfer of energy or an uncontrolled movement of mass from one place to another, or even a transmission of information that could cause harm. And so I looked at that and said, well, we're talking about assets. We've got to have assets in the equation. And whenever people do work, especially in high hazard industries, they're having to use intrinsic hazards in order to create value. So they have to have rotating equipment. They got pumps, they got valves, they got chemicals, they got electricity. So they got all kinds of hazards that are built in, so to speak, in their facilities. And so you have to have hazards to cause harm to an asset. So that's the second ingredient. And then the third ingredient is basically people. You got assets, you got hazards, and you got people. And Dr. James Reason, has been known to say that wherever there are human beings, there will be human error. And so those three elements create the conditions for risk. So I started looking at those and said, okay, how do you manage that? And working with some of my folks, some of my contacts in biotech, it made sense that what we have to pay attention to are the plus signs. Assets plus hazards plus human beings creates risk. And so the plus signs, when you have an asset in close proximity or an intrinsic hazard in close proximity with an asset, that means you must have a pathway. It has to be a pathway for energy to flow or mass to move from one place to another. And so we're going to talk about pathways here in a minute.
So let me interrupt you long enough to ask this question, because I got to ask it. The classic Western economic definition of risk is probability times severity. I don't hear any talk at all around probability or severity. In fact, what I'm hearing you say is that the probability is always one, it's always there, and the severity is a matter of sort of how the defenses work. I really am interested in what you're saying, because this is a new way to define really risk.
Yeah, well, basically, where does risk come from? In this situation, you're talking about the human. And so I like the concept of uncertainty. And so when human beings do work, they create uncertainty.
So it's at this point in the conversation that Tony gets a phone call and his Skype kind of dumps out, and he talks a lot about this notion of uncertainty, the fact that people, humans and human performance, provide this uncertainty, and how that sort of redefines in a new way how we look at risk differently, like safety differently. And he picks right back up and sort of summarizes it right here.
You got assets plus hazards, and then human interaction with both of those. And then that together creates risk, because of human interaction creates the uncertainty in in the work situation. So when people do work, they touch things, and they touch the assets, they touch the hazards that are intended to create value. But when you have those hazards in close proximity with assets, you can create a pathway. It might be worthwhile to give you an example.
Sure.
You know, my daughter just had a baby this last Friday, and she told me that she had an epidural. She was about 5 meters dilated. She was legitimately in an active labor situation. So they gave her an epidural. So I said, I better look this up and think about what it's entailed. And so basically they inject a solution into the spinal column to basically reduce the sensation of pain on the lower extremities of the body while you're delivering a baby. I can't imagine what that feels like. But so the asset, if you look at it from a risk standpoint, a human performance perspective, the asset is my daughter, and the intrinsic hazard is a medication. It may or may not be the right medication, but it's what's in the syringe. And then you have a nurse or perhaps a doctor administering the epidural via syringe. Those three elements together create a risk situation. And so where's the pathway? The pathway is the needle. And so the needle, when inserted into the back and the spinal column, now you've created a pathway for the medication to enter the body. Follow me on the pathway idea?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah. And so who's in control of this? This is the nurse. So the nurse is now administering by depressing the syringe and injecting the medication into her spinal column. And so that action has to be done correctly. And so the idea here is, how do you control that action? And then how do you make sure that the right medication before the needle is inserted into her back, to make sure you have the right medication in the syringe before the nurse even handles it. So that's the idea of pathways and defenses, making sure that you got the right medication in the syringe, and then the person who's actually injecting it injects it correctly.
I like where this is going. It really changes the way we think about risk. What's the advantage of thinking this way?
Well, what it does, as far as the managers and the supervisors are concerned, it helps them know what levers they need to be paying attention to in order to have reliable performance or safe performance in the work that they have. So go back to Holnagel's resilience engineering model, the 4 cornerstones. All right, it gives you a structure of where to focus anticipation. What do I need to anticipate? What do I want to accomplish? And what do I not want to avoid? And then secondly, what do you monitor? What do you pay attention to? Where are the critical points in an activity? And then finally, what do you do to maintain positive control? How do you respond appropriately to maintain positive control? And then finally, after the work is done, what do we do to learn? What can we do to make sure this thing goes right? Or what was significantly different between work as done and work as planned or work as imagined, so we can make appropriate improvements next time. So I think it gives us a way to pinpoint where we need to have positive control in our operations to make sure they go right first time, every time.
How do you envision those leaders creating that positive control? Where's the leader's role in positive control then?
Well, you use the word leader. I always think in terms of work execution. I'm thinking of the supervisor, or even the lead technician or the lead operator that's in charge of a task. But I always go back, what do you do to prepare? This is similar to the pre-job briefing. So you take a pre-job briefing, it helps structure your thinking and conversation and dialogue about what you want to accomplish, but also what you want to avoid. And so it helps you think through what touch points absolutely have to go right. And then how do we control those pathways? What are the defenses that have to be in place and verified to make sure that the work has been proven to be safe before we take those critical steps?
And that makes a lot of sense for non-routine work, but how do you use those ideas, like even the pre-job briefing idea, for routine work? I do it every day.
I think it applies to routine work. Your top performers act this way regularly. They do this naturally. They think in terms of harm, and they think in terms of assets, what has to be protected. And I think if you can structure that into your pre-job briefing, your work execution process, your work management processes, I think what you do is basically slow down the tempo just enough to allow people to talk about what has to go right. And that's the value of the pre-job briefing.
So let me push you a little on that, because at the sharp end where you are, foremen, supervisors, on the floor managers, what's the senior leadership's role in understanding and managing that? How does a senior leader, a plant manager, play in this game?
No, that's a good question. When I talk to managers, I tell them that the time to perform any job is a combination of time to think and time for doing. But in the marketplace, you know this as well as anybody, Todd, that when you're always constrained with what resources are available. And so the time available is usually less than the time required to do a job. So if that's true, then what happens to time to think versus time to do? Time to think usually suffers. And so that usually goes down, and we devote whatever time's available to doing. So I challenge senior managers, especially executives, that they have to design into their work the time that would allow people to think about what they're about to do. And so they really have to not only design in time for pre-job briefing, but also they need to design in some reserve time for things that may not necessarily go right the first time, or things that are unusual might show up in the workplace or during the work activity that had not been anticipated. And so there has to be time available to allow people to stop and get the appropriate expertise on the problem to address the issue before they proceed on. And so that's a second factor, I think, that from an organizational perspective that needs to be considered is expertise. You have the expertise. That's one of the problems I ran into in the biotech industry. I worked with 4 different biotech companies, and as an industry, they tend to hire real smart people. Some of the people have PhDs to be operators, but they spend very little time on technical training. So they depend on their technicians and operators to simply follow the batch production record or the standard operating procedures without really perhaps understanding exactly what they're doing. So that would be a second admonition for leadership, especially executives, to make sure they devote sufficient resources to technical training. So time, I would build in the resources. You got to put the adequate focus on the training, make sure people understand the technology, because if they don't understand the limits or boundaries of safety for the assets, they're not going to be able to recognize when they're really at a critical step.
So we're really talking about, because one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately, I don't know if you've thought about it, is, it's dumb to ask workers to be better. We have to help them create systems, right? But just asking them to be better is not very good. And yet for leaders, generally what we do is ask them to be better. Mm-hmm. Be different, be a better leader. And I've been really trying to peel away the skin of the onion to figure out what it is a leader can do to be better. And you've given me 2, right? They create time, and they They use expertise. They use expertise and resources. What else?
I would say they got to, along with the time and the resources, the managers have actually got to spend some time in the field actually watching the work that they created for the workers. I think they need to devote some time on their own to get out and look at the system that they created to accomplish the work. And so I would encourage managers, not only supervisors, to actually spend some time observing work firsthand and creating an opportunity for a two-way conversation or a dialogue, not a monologue, but a dialogue where the manager and executive actually not only provide feedback to the worker about his or her performance, but also soliciting feedback from the frontline worker about the integrity and the support for the work that they're being asked to do. So I'd say that's a third element that senior managers and middle managers as well as supervisors need to be doing. They need to provide the time build in time in their own schedule to actually get out and watch work.
How do we get them to redefine risk in this kind of new approach you're taking, this asset plus hazard plus person? I
think to me it's an issue of vocabulary, Todd. When I was at the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations back in the middle 90s, we realized that we had to have a paradigm shift in the way we thought about human performance. And we were working with Dr. James Reason with this at the time, and we realized that we had to create a vocabulary, a glossary of terms, if you will, on how to talk about human performance in a proactive way, not necessarily just a reactive way. So we created that vocabulary. We started using a few hyphenated words like latent organizational weakness, or we actually use some terms like error precursors, and so we had to start using a different vocabulary. And I like what Carl White said. You were at that conference. It was a high reliability organizing conference. Where was it? Midland, or was it down in Texas?
Right. Someplace good, I bet. Someplace exciting.
Yeah. But Carl said, if you want to change the way you think, change the words that you use.
Right.
Remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. And so that resonated with me, and I took that, and I've been admonishing the managers. If you want to change the way you think about risk, you got to start using the vocabulary, and you got to use that vocabulary in everyday operations. And so part of my manager training is to help them understand that when we're talking about events, what is an event? What do we mean by human error? What do we mean by a critical step? These words have meaning, and you need to understand those meanings. And so I always tell managers that you cannot manage what you do not understand. And if they do not understand the elements and concepts and principles and the vocabulary that goes with those principles, then how can you manage it? How can you even talk about it and communicate it in the workplace?
So what do we do with this idea then? I think this is really exciting, because I'll just straight out tell you, I think companies are way too fixated on significance, on consequence. And because they're so fixated on what's either happened or going to happen, they sort of lose the whole notion of how the event is happening. Because we can prevent an event if we identify it while it's happening, right? Mm-hmm. How do we get this new vocabulary, these new ideas, so that they have legs? For some crazy reason, this definition of risk, probability times severity, has been hardwired into people's thinking, and it's not terribly accurate.
Well, it's not. It doesn't have the level of granularity that you need in order to manage the human fallibility in the workplace.
And if I can interrupt you, I would think the reason the granularity is not there is because probability times severity doesn't have anything to do with people. It leaves out the human factor completely.
Exactly. So I talk about where people touch things, right, in the work. And so we got to start thinking about work as a force over a distance. So we go back to definitions about force over distance, about what work is. And so where do people create value? And so that's the work that you were trying to accomplish. That's the value add that's trying to accomplish the mission of the organization. And wherever those points are in your operations, that's what you manage. So I always, managers tend to think, well, we have to prevent all errors, and that just does not work. In fact, I tell managers to their face, I'm not interested in preventing human error. What I'm interested in is managing the risk. Where is the risk? And the risk is at those touch points where we're going to transfer energy, we're going to move mass, or we're going to create and transmit information that could cause harm. And where are those points in the work activity?
What do managers say to you when you say you're not interested in managing human error?
They agree. They realize, I would say most of them. Most of them tend to agree, but it's for some it's a definite paradigm shift for them to realize. Hey, actually, some of them are. I'd say for the most part, most are relieved. They're relieved if they don't have to pay attention to everything, and they have to just target what really has to go right. In fact, I when we talk about human reliability in the class, the general thumb rule is, human beings are around 99.9%. And so when we talk about steps or actions that are not critical steps, I ask them, is 99% good enough for a non-critical step? They realize, yes, it is. Most time that's good enough for anything that's not critical. And for those who would be listening, I think it might be worthwhile to review what a critical step is. It's a human action that will trigger immediate, irreversible, intolerable harm to an asset if that action or preceding action is done improperly. So anything else, I'd say 99.9% reliability is good enough. So I can respond to errors at those situations and not suffer serious harm. So I'd say for the most part, managers agree with the idea, the concept, and what this does is it helps them think through what do they need to pay attention to, going back to the cornerstones of resilience engineering. So I think this way of thinking is consistent with the cornerstones of resilience engineering.
So what are you going to do for 2016? What are your thinking? Where's your thinking taking you? What are you reading? What's going to be different for this year, for the new year?
Well, for me, it's one is getting this book out.
Good for you. Good for you.
Getting this book out. Right now, the tentative title of that book is Risk-Based Thinking, Managing the Uncertainty of Human Error in Operations. That's the preliminary title of the book. I can't tell you. I don't have a contract with a publisher just yet, but I'm in the process of doing that. So I'm basically stating to everyone that I'm committing to getting this book out early in 2016.
Okay, I heard that, and we'll hold you to that, baby. We're going to hold you to that.
Good. I need the accountability.
Ah, yes. Anytime Tony Muschara says, good, I need the accountability, is probably when we should end the conversation at some point. What'd you think? His notion around risk, I think, is much more contemporary. I'm actually really excited about this book. I can't even wait for it to come out. I think we have to sort of step up to the plate and admit publicly that our traditional views of risk have not helped us understand risk. And these new, more contemporary, novel views of risk, I think, are much more interesting. And if you're listening to what Tony says, that relationship between the asset, the hazard, and the person, and you're doubling down with what, for instance, John Adams is saying about this notion of a risk thermostat, that we adjust risk based upon sort of our identification of hazard, our comfort levels. All those things are really important parts of the way we understand and look at risk. I think that's pretty powerful stuff. And I think it gives us a lot of fodder to think about for the year to come. I want to challenge you as a new view person, as a safety differently person, whether you're in DevOps or aviation safety or healthcare or, working at a factory. I want to challenge you to really ask this question. Do we understand risk at the sharp end of the stick well enough to actually manage work at the planning and management leadership end of the stick? And I think that's a really good question, a really good question. That is the podcast for today. Tony Muschara always makes me think, and I'm glad you're here. Thank you for being a part of this. 2016 promises to be a great year for us. We will see, won't we? Lots of great things coming up, lots of great people on the podcast, so keep listening. Please subscribe. Give us your feedback. Rate us. Give us a nice rating. That would be sweet. Tell your friends. Keep the numbers up. And until then, as always, learn something new every single day. You kind of did that today. Have as much fun as you can possibly squeeze out of this thing. And for goodness sakes, be safe.
You can fall over on a tugboat. You can't fall over on a submarine.